All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on language access and education. My name is Nasreen Al-Hashim, and I will be introducing our first speaker for today. We're thrilled to have you all here, and we'll be spending the next 75 minutes discussing why language access and education matters, how it impacts families in the school community, and how you can work effectively with interpreters to make sure every family feels heard and supported. Before we get started, let's take a moment to get to know each other. I'll ask a few questions, and if you can all respond in the chat. Tell us where you're joining from, what languages you wish you could speak, and how many countries have you visited? Go ahead and tell us in the chat. So where are you joining us from today? Christina is from the Republic, and she wishes she could speak Spanish, and she's visited one country. Thank you, Christina. All right, we have Mount Vernon, Washington, Italian, and 3 countries. Thank you, Elizabeth. Olga is joining us from the USA. She wishes she could speak Spanish and Italian, and she's visited 10 countries. Wow, Olga. All right, Nikki is joining from Washington State. He wishes he could speak French, and he's visited 1 country. It's great to hear how many people are coming from all over the place to talk about language access and education. Let's talk about what we're going to be covering today, our objectives. By the end of this webinar, you will understand why language access is both essential and legally required. You will learn how to effectively interact with families who have limited English proficiency, are emergent bilinguals, or have a non-English preferred language. And you'll gain practical strategies for working with interpreters to support communication. We will start with a quick poll and to get a sense of your knowledge. I'll go ahead and answer the poll, please. It asks, are interpreters legally required for school family communications? Yes, no, or not sure. Are schools legally required to provide interpreters when they are interacting with families? Give that a minute. Okay. All right, so it seems that most have answered yes, and a few answers of not sure. So to give us more clarity and expand on this topic, we have Bruce Adelson with us. He is our first speaker for today. Bruce is a highly regarded expert in the areas of language access, disability access, and compliance. With his extensive experience and expertise, he serves as the Americans and Disabilities Act consultant to both the Idaho Supreme Court and New Mexico Administrative Office of Courts. Prior to his current role, Bruce was a senior trial attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice, where he worked to ensure compliance with federal laws protecting the rights of individuals with disabilities. In addition to his consulting work, Bruce is also a respected member of the academic community. He currently serves on the faculty of Georgetown University School of Medicine and the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, where he teaches implicit bias in healthcare. Bruce has also taught a number of other prestigious institutes, including Harvard University, Cornell University, Auburn University, the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health, and the University of Baltimore School of Law. Welcome, Bruce. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Nazreen. Thank you so much for the introduction and good afternoon to everyone. So, what I thought we would do is let's talk a little bit about some background, the legalities of language access in public schools. What's interesting about language access in public schools, there are numerous statutes highlighted by one that I'll mention momentarily that actually mention language in the words of the statute. Like, for example, the language spoken by native language spoken by parents or guardians. There are federal and state laws that require schools, public schools, to provide language access. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is perhaps one of the best known. Under that law, schools must ensure meaningful access to information for families who do not speak English fluently. So they would be considered LEP or limited English proficient. Many state and local policies going beyond the laws reinforce this requirement and the need to provide meaningful access through language to parents and guardians of students in public schools. And simply put, schools are legally required to provide interpreters and translated materials for families who need them. And this applies to schools that receive federal funding. That's either federal funding directly through the federal government or federal money that passes through the state, passes down to the school district, for example. It still retains its federal origins. In addition, excuse me, to Title VI, there are also other laws that apply that have similar language access requirements, like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Equal Education Opportunity Act. So these laws, as I said, for the most part, specifically mention the requirement, the need to provide language access in the native language of the parents or guardians as needed. And that's extremely important in a public school context for many reasons, because if you have a language barrier, parents or guardians will be unable to understand what is happening with their children, particularly minor children, whether it's academically or whether there's a disciplinary issue, for example. So when families face these language barriers, they struggle to engage with their child's education, with the teachers, administrators, and counselors. And some common barriers include the overarching description, the language barrier. Parents may not, excuse me, understand school policies, rules, regulations, expectations, teacher feedback, or special education processes. And the special education processes, I think, can be summarized in many ways by the IEP, the Individual Education Plan today. Because courts have pretty consistently held that for parents to understand and engage in the process of developing and implementing IEPs, which are very important for students with disabilities, they must understand what's in the plan. They must be able to communicate questions, responses, understandings with the school. If they cannot do that, then in addition to there being discrimination based on language, you have the situation where minor children are perhaps being told things that their parents or guardians just don't understand. That's a problem for all of us who are parents and have or have had kids in public school. We know that they're inundated with information on a regular basis. A lot of that information is vital for their children's education and their ability, as I said, to engage in the schooling of their children. So that's in part one of the policy reasons, if you will, why language access in public schools is just so vitally important. Then you also have emotional barriers, this feeling left out, marginalized, unable to advocate for your own children, it can be very stressful and disheartening and really make you wonder about your what you're doing as a parent for the benefit of your children. You're just at a loss to understand what's happening in the classroom and what additional services, programs may be available. You are, in a way, pushed to the side, whether intentionally or not. And that's all because of the inability to understand English and the inability or the failure of particular schools or particular districts to comply with the law, federal and state, and offer that meaningful access through language that's so desperately needed. In addition to the language barrier and emotional barrier, there are also cultural barriers. There are different cultures, people coming from different countries and areas of the world. There are different expectations about education, communication styles, and authority figures all can lead to misunderstandings. There are many different responses from people depending on where they're from and what their cultural experiences are to the principal and whether or not they can engage with the principal and whether or not the principal is an unapproachable figure. And I know that having worked in public schools and represented parents or LEP, this issue comes up all the time, and it's a significant one in order to ensure that meaningful access that the law requires, and more, I guess, to the emotional point, assuring parents that they understand what's happening, what's being offered, how their child is doing, are there issues that they need to be concerned about. So culture, this is a marriage, if you will, between culture and language, which is just so important. Briefly, if you could, excuse me, type in the chat, please, for one of our quick interactive activities. What challenges have you experienced when communicating with LEP families? And just type your answers in the chat, please. That will be very helpful to understand what your experience is, where you're coming from, and what you have actually seen. So please type in the chat, what challenges have you experienced around or concerning communicating with LEP parents? So I'm going to move on now. And let's talk a little bit about language access, friendly schools, accommodating schools, welcoming schools. And one of the ways to do that is developing and using a language access plan. Okay, so what is that? Well, we all make plans. We all have plans to, whatever the plan is for. And a plan in the language access context in public schools is really important because you get to lay out exactly what the understanding of the school and the district is about legal requirements, but also lay out some of the barriers that we've already discussed, whether they be emotional or cultural, and also have information for how to contact interpreters. So the bottom line is that every school should have a language access plan to ensure that all families are getting the support they need and that the law requires. And the courts have been pretty consistent in saying, yeah, you have to have a language access plan. And if you look at some of the statutes I talked about, the statutes say specifically plan for providing information about parent-teacher meetings, for example, or information about the IEP conference in the native language of the parents. So that there are these expectations that have been written in statutes, regulations, guidance, policies for years, with the always background understanding that, that how could you possibly know what's happening in your child's school without this roadmap. And so the language access plan is really a good roadmap for how do you get to providing that access that enables parents to get beyond the barriers or overcome the barriers with the help of the school districts that I mentioned earlier. So what is a good plan? What should the language access plan include? Well, providing it should lay out consistent procedures for providing interpreting and translation services so that the school employees understand what's expected of them and that the policies are written to not only be legally compliant, but to explain quite plainly what is needed to consistently provide this language access, this meaningful access to school programs, services, and activities to parents who are LEP. Train staff, training, good training, not just training for the sake of training, training that's effective is absolutely essential. So having trained staff who understand when and how to use these language access services, interpreter and translator. Because unless staff understand why they should use it or how to use these services, they may not be inclined or even understand that they're available or inclined to use them. So putting that into policy is really, really important. Clear communication with families about their right to language access services. So you are required by law to provide notices, including in the school itself and on certain important documents like a notice to parents of a parent-teacher conference, if there's a disciplinary issue and a meeting with the principal, if there's a discussion about new courses that are available at the school or new programs, there must be a notice. And the notice should be in the most prevalent languages that are spoken by families in your community. And information about if you need language access services, call this number or let us know, and we will provide you with an interpreter, for example, and translated documents. So that notice about the right to language access is enshrined in law and is very important. And also, I think what can also happen just in the day-to-day operation of a public school, maybe there comes a moment during the day where you forget how to access language services, or maybe you're just unsure or have questions about it. Call your district office, call the Board of Education, whatever the operative organizational phrase is for you locally, and ask them. And they should be able to help you. One of the, I think too, that we'll touch on now and a little bit later, simple steps for teachers and staff in the whole language access process, if you will. So keep an updated list of interpreter resources for the school district. And that may be information about language services, maybe translated documents, maybe even information about specific language services providers to help families. Make sure families know how to request language access services. It's not something that, and I should also add, it's free. You can't be charged for these services by law. They're free of charge to people who need them, who are limited English proficient. And be very proactive and advocate. If you suspect a family needs language support, don't wait for them to ask, offer it. So providing that notice at the front desk when you come into a school building, you have the right to free, meaningful access language services through a qualified interpreter or translator. And the notice may have, if it's done according to best practices, information briefly in several languages. Call this number if you need language services, for example, and maybe that's written in Arabic, in Spanish, in Tagalog, in Japanese. if those languages are widely spoken in your community. So this is not just a choice, it's the law, but it's also providing what families and children need to pursue their education and have if meaningful education success and involvement in programs and services. So that's a good kind of summary for now about the basics of language services. And now I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker. For the second part of the webinar, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Puha. Elizabeth, good afternoon.
Hi, Bruce. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, let me give you a little information about Elizabeth. She's a dedicated language access specialist with over 11 years of experience in K through 12 education, including the last 3 as a language access coordinator. Currently, Elizabeth is leading efforts to develop and enhance a language access program in Mount Vernon School District, where she is navigating the unique challenges of serving an Indigenous community with diverse linguistic and cultural needs. And Elizabeth, I'm very interested in hearing about that. A state DSHS certified medical and social interpreter in Spanish and French, Elizabeth specializes in policy compliance, training, and program management with a strong commitment to providing to bridging language barriers. Also, she oversees interpreter services and advocates for plain language to make critical information accessible to everybody. So thank you and welcome, Elizabeth. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Bruce, for that introduction. Let me share my screen before we begin. Very well. So now that we have set the stage by understanding the importance of language access and how to create an inclusive school environment, let's focus on a very important component, which is effectively communicating with families who are with limited English proficiency. So before we dive a little bit later into a demonstration, let's review some best practices, but also some common pitfalls when communicating with LEP families. So some of the best practices, we want to make sure that as administrators and teachers, you are speaking directly to the parent or guardian, not to the interpreter. That just makes, we are ensuring that that communication is between both of you. And it just, the interpreter is almost, it's almost invisible. Also use plain language. Avoid any acronyms or very complex terminology or jargon. Part of my work here in school districts involves working with administrators and teachers on using just simple language when they're presenting at school events and meetings, or when drafting written communication. So you want to think about your audience. You may not address your parents, whether they're multilingual or not, the same way that maybe you address your colleagues. So just use plain language. Another best practice is to be culturally sensitive. So you want to respect the different ways of communicating across cultures. And also check for understanding. We don't want to assume that a nod means that they understand. So you want to ask open-ended questions. And some pitfalls that we want to avoid is do not use students or children as interpreters. And also do not rely on untrained multilingual staff to interpret important conversations. Bruce just went over the legal foundation of these, and we really don't want to, we want to avoid these common mistakes. It's great to leverage multilingual staff, but they can assist maybe with basic communication, casual conversations. But if they're not trained, we don't want to use untrained multilingual staff for important conversations with our multilingual families. So with these guidelines in mind, let's actually see how these practices would work in practice. So we are going to do a little demonstration, myself as a staff member, and we're going to be explaining the role of an interpreter in education. So I will be playing the role of the teacher, and then Jana will be our Arabic interpreter, and Nisreen will play the role of the parent. So listen up, and we're gonna have a little question for you afterwards. Okay, so let's begin. Let's see. Good afternoon, Ms. El Hashim. My name is Ms. Puga, and I'm Selena's fourth grade teacher.
مساء الخير السيدة الهاشم، اسمي السيدة بوغا، أنا معلمة سيلينا للصف الرابع.
I'd like to talk with you today about Selena's progress in reading and math, and also discuss any questions or concerns that you might have.
حابة أحكي معك بخصوص تطور سيلينا بالقراءة والرياضيات ومناقشة أي أسئلة أو مخاوف عندك إياها.
And I have Ms. Suleiman with us today. She is an interpreter, and she will interpret our conversation. Please speak directly to me, and if at any point you need me to repeat or explain something, please let me know.
موجودة معنا السيدة جنى سليمان، المترجمة يلي حتكون عم تترجم حديثنا اليوم. حكينا لإلي بشكل مباشر، اعملي معروف. إذا حسيتي بحيالله وقت إنه بدك عدلك أو أشرح لك شيء، خليني أعرف، اعملي معروف.
And now we just want to demonstrate the interpreter. They will need to say their statement as what their role is. And so I'm going to let Jenna do that.
مساء الخير السيدة الهاشم، اسمي السيدة جنى سليمان، المترجمة لحضرتك. رح كون عم ترجم كل شي بتقوله السيدة بوغا وحضرتك بتقولي. كل شي بينحكى بالمقابلة بضل سري. إذا عزت أي توضيح رح أعمل إيدي هيك تأتدخل. Good afternoon, Ms. Puga. I am Ms. Slayman, your interpreter. I'm going to interpret everything Mrs. El Hashim says and everything you say. Everything said in this meeting will remain confidential. If I need to ask for clarification, I will put my hand up like this to interject.
شكرا مسز بوغا على هالاجتماع اليوم تأطمن على سلينا.
Thank you, Ms. Puga, for this interview to check on Selena.
Great, thank you. So that's the end of the demonstration, the role playing. We want to ask attendees, and you can answer in the chat, what strategies in the demonstration help to create clear communication with the parent? Want to just pop that answer in the chat, just your thoughts. Your explanation of the process, yeah. Thank you, Olga. You can keep adding your comments in the chat. We're gonna shift now our focus to effectively working with interpreters, which is another critical piece to ensure clear communication. So let me, my slides. So it's really important to understand what the role of an interpreter is. You already saw a little bit of this in that demonstration. But as administrators and teachers, you must understand that interpreters act as neutral communicators. Their job is to accurately relay information between school staff and families. Interpreters are not advocates. They are not caseworkers. They are not decision makers. So interpreters abide by a code of ethics. And there are many components to the code of ethics and standards of practice, but today we want to focus on 3 of them. And it's confidentiality, accuracy, and impartiality. And really what that means is confidentiality means that interpreters will not share information outside of the session. So really respecting the privacy of that meeting. And then accuracy, that means that the interpreter will interpret everything without adding or omitting any of the information. And impartiality, that means that the interpreter will not take sides. So they will refrain from advising, projecting personal opinions or beliefs. They will remain neutral as interpreters. So having covered the core responsibilities and ethical standards of interpreters, we'll now look at some practical tips to ensure that that interaction is smooth before and after any meeting you have when using interpreters. And so we have some pre-session tips. You want to brief the interpreter on the meeting's context and terminology. That may include providing any documents that will be discussed during the meeting. For example, for special education meetings, make sure that you have an additional copy for the interpreter to review. Also share the names and titles of the staff member present. You also want to confirm which mode of interpreting will be best during the meeting. Will that be simultaneous or will that be consecutive? Also, it's very important that as an administrator or teacher, you discuss with the interpreter how misunderstandings will be handled. So for example, you want to encourage the interpreter to ask about any unfamiliar terms, or that you will be checking for understanding by asking if the family understands what is being said. You do not want to depend on the interpreter to ensure understanding. That is your responsibility as the administrator or teacher that's using an interpreter. And after the session, some helpful tips. Well, you want to debrief with the interpreter. So right after the session, take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about what worked well, what could be improved. You want to ask targeted questions. Maybe was the pace of the meeting appropriate for interpretation? Were there moments where language or cultural references could have been more clear? And you also, during the post session, you want to discuss any maybe cultural nuances or communication challenges that arose. And so you want to make sure that you leave time for a pre-session and a post-session when you schedule an interpreter. So before we move forward to our final section, I also just want to share that as part of the follow-up resources, we'll be sharing a template checklist of a pre and post session. And we just want to clarify that while that checklist is designed for interpreters, it is helpful for you as teachers and administrators to be aware of this tool, and so that you can share it with interpreters in your buildings who could benefit from having a tool like this. So, okay, with that in mind, I think it's time to turn it back over to Bruce to share some takeaways, right? And then we have a Q&A.
Yes, I believe so. Let's see, where is my So key takeaways, if you look at your screen now, knowing and sharing your district's interpreter request process. And that really helps to ensure the meaningful access requirements are fulfilled and that accurate, trained language access professionals are bridging the barriers that we talked about earlier. Ensure your school's language access plan is current and compliant. Very important because we just had a census a couple of years ago. Have you updated your plan since then to reflect the new demographics in your community? Often it is recommended that a language access plan be updated yearly because populations do change. That means language changes, and a language that you were not focusing on 2 years ago may be a prime language now in your locality. Use trained interpreters for all interactions with LEP families. You heard Elizabeth talk about not using minor children, certainly not using the children who are students themselves. And to be perfectly honest, if my parents were LEP with my early public school struggles, we'll put it that way, boy, I would love an opportunity to not accurately interpret from my parents when the school was talking about, well, we need to do A, B, and C with Bruce to ensure that he's getting all the benefits from our local school district. So don't use the children who are the students in particular as interpreters. Use trained interpreters, period. Apply pre and post session best practices, which we heard Elizabeth talk about. That's really so important. And having, overall with the language access plan issues that we discussed and the need to have a language access plan that's current, you need to make sure that everybody understands that this is not optional, it's legally required. But more than that, if you're in public education, you should know that making sure that the families are involved actively can be a huge benefit to the children as well as to the schools, and ensuring that there's the equal access to school programs and activities, and that the student is getting all they need in order to succeed. So what can you do immediately? So let's talk a little bit about that. Learn, as we talked about, the actionable steps you could do right now. You could do when we're done with the webinar. Learn your district's interpreter request process and share it with colleagues. If people don't know how to access language access services, then they're not going to be accessed. And that creates a whole other host of issues, legal issues for the school district, and families that are disaffected feel that they're being marginalized, all because of language. Commit to always use trained interpreters, qualified interpreters for interactions with LEP families. Trained interpreters are the ones who understand cultural issues, terminology that's used in public schools, and are the ones who are equipped to provide the services that are required by law and are required to ensure that our children are being given the best possible education. Apply pre and post session best practices when working with interpreters. That's something Elizabeth did a great job of explaining that. So those are things that can happen immediately. Those are things that can happen when we're done with the webinar today. And what I'd like to do is go into some Q&A now. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Put your questions in the chat, please. And we'll answer as many as we can. So I'm going to turn to my friend Elizabeth and ask Elizabeth. So we have numerous questions today. One of the issues that popped up earlier in the chat when we asked about the challenges that are faced in situations involving LEP people, just about everybody mentioned culture and cultural differences. what are your thoughts on how to ensure that cultural practices are not a barrier? And also, how do you explain that to the school district?
Thank you, Bruce. I think that's a great question. And, as part of the training, we have to make sure that, we train staff so that, they learn the different ways that cultures communicate. The eye contact, maybe the body language, and we can leverage, our own families to teach us those things. And multilingual staff, that are from those cultures. We want to, make sure that we are culturally responsive, right? So respect, and integrate and recognize the different cultural backgrounds. And so we can incorporate that in when we train, staff, in schools.
Is there anything that you've encountered when there's a new community that has their recent arrivals to this particular school district, and they may be from a country or a region that most of the people in the district have not experienced in school? How do you deal with that?
I actually experienced that personally when I moved to this district, with a growing population, of it's an indigenous population from Mexico and then Central America. And I had to sit with our indigenous liaison, to teach me, some of these things. So the hierarchy maybe in, within their culture, that we needed to address maybe the male in the family rather than the female of the family. And so little things like that I had to learn. And so those are things that we are also sharing with our staff on how to be respectful and embrace these cultures and not to assume, right, anything. So yeah, we go straight to, and then we also, when we held an event with these families, and so that we could, we had interpreters there, and we wanted feedback, like what is the best way for us to communicate with you? And they shared, we want phone calls. We want you to call me. Don't send me. And so that's all part of that training and building that language access plan. Yeah. So I had to learn that.
Wow. Is that something? I mean, that must have been, if there were differences that whether you expected or not, that must have been a real incredible experience to hear just some of the things that you talked about. How do you deal with that? I guess that novelty element that I didn't know that. I haven't heard that before. You've never done that. How do you then pivot to accommodate to what you just learned?
Well, we have to, if we're getting that feedback from those families, this is what I need you to do. This is how I communicate best, then we need to implement that. So for example, for these parents, written communication does not work because there were so many variants in this indigenous language that sending a written note home is not going to work. We're not communicating effectively. So then we have to create audio recordings of, our letters that go out, our communication, or make phone calls when it's, an event or something happening, or making sure that if it's a meeting, we have somebody there in person. So we did have to make that shift where now for these population, we make sure that they have the communication, and we're still working on that. I've only been here for 90 days. So
Wow.
we're building a program from the ground up. But so the shift was making sure that communication was available in audio format for this population.
Well, it's funny when you mentioned audio, I was thinking, am I correct that many of the indigenous communities, let's say in Mexico or other parts of Central America, their language may not have a written component? Is that true?
That is true.
So that it has to be audio or video or a combination of those.
Correct. So that was new, and we're still, I mean, I still have, you know, a lot of staff that will ask me, can I have these translated into, you know, X indigenous language? No, and please make that communication simple, simple, simple. Sixth grade literacy level, whether, you know, whether it's native speakers, some non-native speakers, is just easier. And then that way we can create the audio recording and make sure that this important information is reaching all of our families.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you mentioned the grade level, that has to be part of the process in making the information that's being provided culturally applicable. That if the community reads, writes, understands oral communication at a certain grade level, it is really important that the school know that.
Absolutely. Yeah, Bruce. And it's all part of those frequent conversations with administrators, with staff, and it has to be embedded in the training staff.
Okay. Well, I still want to hear, maybe not today, more about this indigenous experience. That always, indigenous languages are very much of interest to me.
Yeah,
so
I would love to. Yes.
Oh yeah, I look forward to that. I thank you so much for that. There's an interesting question in the chat. In your example, the teacher is leading the meeting. Let's say it's an IEP meeting. Do you train your teachers to take on this role? In most of the interpreter trainings, the interpreter is listed as managing the meeting. So what's your sense of that question?
Yeah, and I saw that question. I thought that was a great question. And again, we're not making rules. I think it's the discretion. Every meeting has a different dynamic. But if we have a trained staff or administrator working with interpreters, then it's fine. They can, you know, they can introduce the interpreter. They can say they will be interpreting, you know, everything, and make sure that you're making that eye contact with me. Or it can be part of that pre-session, right? Where the administrator then says, make sure that, you know, you're doing your introduction so that we know that everything will remain private, and the parent knows that they can ask questions and they can just make eye contact directly to me, where to sit. So there are no harsh rules. It's really, I think it depends on the dynamic of the meeting, but it would be a good pre-session discussion to have.
Okay, I could see that. And that also kind of leads into, there was another question concerning cultural challenges, and this one referenced Ramadan. So is what the best practices that you're discussing and cultural awareness, that must also relate to religious differences that people may not be familiar with, but that are distinctive and important. Have you experienced that as an issue?
I have experienced that as wearing my hat of an interpreter, where you know, it's part of the code of ethics, right? So although we're not going to give our personal opinion or make assumptions as interpreters, but when you have a trained interpreter, when staff in education are working with trained interpreters, and they see those you know, cultural differences or religious, just something is not quite clear, you can see it right in the parent's face, the body language. And as a trained interpreter, they will raise their hand, just like our Arabic interpreter said, and they will interject and maybe say a statement like, as the interpreter, you know, I feel like we may need to clarify, or can we ask another question, or can I check with the parent XXS? So that there is that transparency across the board. So I have experienced that as an interpreter. And as a language access coordinator, I guess not yet. I said not yet because it will come, right?
Yeah, it will come. That's right. As soon as you said that, I thought, oh, it's coming. We just don't know when. This is a good question, and that was just posted in about how do you handle a situation when the teacher who speaks the same language as the interpreter kind of takes over the interpreter role? What do you do then?
That has happened to me, Bruce.
I bet.
So again, that pre-session, we have a dual language program in our district, and we have teachers that are multilingual. But again, multilingual does not mean interpreter. So that's part of the pre-session. And so as the administrator or the teacher that speaks the language, then you need to check with your interpreter. You're aware I'm also fluent in X language. And maybe the teacher wants to facilitate the whole meeting in that language, and then the interpreter is there for clarification, or that needs to be that conversation where the interpreter will say, well, then you need to facilitate the entire meeting in English and I will be the interpreter. And if at any point I see that you are moving away from that role as a training interpreter, I will raise my hand, interject, and kindly remind you, that I'm here to serve as the interpreter. So that is something that you could do. We see that often, and we want to make sure multilingual staff cannot do both. And we don't want parents to miss any critical information.
Well, you must see many situations where someone thinks that they are multilingual, but they're not. And then there's do you have any concern then, or is it more difficult to say in the best professional voice, your language ability isn't what you think it is, let's say? I mean, that must be kind of difficult.
It is difficult. And as part of the training sessions that I do with multilingual staff to make sure that they're trained, we rehearse those type of interjections that they need to happen, because they feel, I don't want to come across as disrespectful to my principal and no, remember, you are wearing the hat of an interpreter, and the goal is that our families are having, that clear communication, and we're removing that barrier. So we practice, and it has to be professional, but it has to be assertive and direct.
Yeah, so there's no misunderstanding.
Correct.
Okay, great, thank you. What about, let's see, here's one. I really appreciate you emphasizing the need to use simple and plain language. I am noticing that this concept needs to be emphasized and shared more with all school staff to make information more accessible to families. What do you think of that?
Right before the webinar, Bruce, I had a conversation with one of the executive directors, and this was about that. I want to say it has to be included in your training with staff. When your training staff, include content about simple language. So my experience today, right before the webinar, this director was sending out a one-page letter full, from top to bottom, right? Informing families about a unit that was being taught in one of the content areas. And they wanted it translated in our top 3 languages for the district. One of them is one of our indigenous languages. And so I read the letter, and it was so dense, just very dense. And I said, even for an English native speaker, this is a lot. So we worked together to make it shorter, simple. Again, that target, and it's not a rule, but from the trainings I have attended, sixth grade literacy level
Mhm.
is very, it's a good baseline. And she came back and she simplified that, and it was
Oh, great.
half the length, and now we can do a 1.5 minute audio in our indigenous language of that content because it's simple and
Mm.
it's easier for translation into the other languages. So yes, plain simple language is really, really important in language access.
Wow, what a great example that is. That really resonates on a lot of different levels. Let's see, what's the next? Oh, here's one. If parents are being told by a school to bring their own interpreter in, or a friend, a relative, or a professional one, as they are not providing any, the school's not providing any, what would be the best way for a parent to insist on providing the professional qualified interpreter?
Trying to see if I understand the question. So the school is telling the parent to bring their own interpreter?
Well, I think that it seems to me that well, we can take it, look at it either way, that the school does not provide interpreters, so that the parent is bringing their own interpreter, or the school says, bring your own. So they're pretty close, but then I'll leave that to you. How do you deal with that?
Should we replay the whole webinar?
Yeah, sure. Let's go.
Well, as we discussed today, it is a law to provide an interpreter. So schools need to provide an interpreter, and we cannot be telling parents bring your own. If you circumstances, things happen, if you cannot access an in-person interpreter, then access over the phone interpreters and over the phone service. And if you don't have one, make sure that you get one, because then you can have someone trained to assist with the communication barrier. Now, if a parent comes, and we have had this situation where parents come and they will bring a family member, a community member, an advocate, and it's their interpreter, and they are very adamant about using that person. And I want this person to be my interpreter. That is the parent's choice. And, we can tell them, what we tell them is, well, you have access to a free interpreter, so we would be happy to have someone available. But we've had parents that just absolutely do not want interpreters, and they want to use this person. What we have said is, may the interpreter stay in the room in case they are needed. And sometimes they say, yes, that's fine. But if they say no, then at the same time, we have to respect that parent's decision, and then we have dismissed the interpreter. But it's very rare that has happened.
That was going to be my next question. I'm glad to hear that it's very rare. That's not something that you encounter regularly. Let's see. How about, as a community liaison, I have multiple parents calling me with that question when the school would not provide an interpreter. So as the community liaison, whether they work for the district, they volunteer for the district. So how do they then answer the question and provide the information that's being requested?
So let me see if I understand this. So they have multiple parents that are calling the community liaison that the school is not providing an interpreter. As a community liaison, I think you can contact the district and say, hey, this is our parents by law, they need an interpreter. They need an interpreter, and have the parent also talk to the school, but they need to be providing those interpreters. It's understandable when sometimes it's last minute things and they don't have somebody in person. But again, they can have access to a trained interpreter over the phone, and still remove that language barrier. So there's no shortcuts. There are no shortcuts. Schools have to provide interpreters to communicate with multilingual families.
Okay, let's see. We have some questions beyond the chat. What do you do if a parent or guardian walks in and the school doesn't understand what language they're speaking? Then what's the next step?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So again, we talked about having a language access plan in schools. So as part of your language access plan in schools, school main offices should have a language poster in their main office, or sometimes they call them I speak posters or
Yeah.
point to your language posters. And so you should have those in at least your top languages. I've seen them anywhere from 10 to 40 languages listed on those posters based on your district's needs. And you can just politely, you can point to English and then put, help the parents so that they can point to their language, and the language will be, in English and in their language, so they can identify that. And so have a language poster, and if for some reason a language poster, I will say, is not available yet, because it should be, then you can call an over-the-phone interpreting service, and they can help you with identifying the language.
So they must be able, then I would assume then that the parent would speak by phone with the interpreter, and then the
Correct.
interpreter would say, oh, this person speaks X language.
Correct. And many of the on-demand services, they have that feature now, or that ability where the parent can say something, and then they can identify the language, and we will just please hold, and then we'll connect an interpreter.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. And here's this question also, I think this is interesting. What are your thoughts about having parent volunteers act as interpreters for other families?
What are my thoughts? They should only be used if they are trained. So if they have been trained and their language proficiency has been tested, you can use them. But if it's just a volunteer and they have no training, the language proficiency hasn't been tested, they should not be used as interpreters.
I would think you must run into that too, that the sense of what parents wanting to help, speaking whatever the language is and wanting to jump right in, that must also bring with it some challenges in explaining what you just did.
Mm-hmm. It really does, but again, it goes back to I sound like a broken record. By a multilingual or bilingual person does not mean that they are an interpreter.
You should have a slide that repeats that over and over again.
Let's see if I can work on that in 10 seconds.
All right, yeah, there you go. I know you can, so there's no doubt about that. Do you have, and here's a question, do you have educational field? Oh, I'm sorry. I missed the one I wanted to address. From my experience, using parents from the community can get sticky, as many families are reluctant to have someone from their community know their business. So I would really hesitate to use the practice. Does that refer to like concerns about privacy?
That's exactly what I was thinking, Bruce. And actually, this just right away reminded me of our Indigenous community. It's a very, very small community. So it's very challenging to find interpreters in those languages. But, and some, being a tight-knit community, then that's where the trained interpreter and abiding by that code of ethics comes in handy. Where at the beginning, that interpreter is letting the parent or guardian know everything that we discuss here will remain confidential. I will not share this with anyone. The teacher will not share this with anyone. We are not going to share this outside of this session. And just making sure that we are reiterating that, because it does become a challenge, especially with very, very small communities and just for miles and miles, not having access to interpreters.
Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense. Let's see, what types of school events, so this is good. What types of school events require professional interpreters?
That's a good question. Let's see. Simply put, any event where important information is shared with families and they need full access. Whether that is welcome to kindergarten event, a family engagement event, enrollment and registration. Last night we had an event, an information night on our dual language program. And we had simultaneous interpretation in Spanish and Mixteco. The presentation was delivered in English. So really any event where important information is shared and that families have the right to access.
I would think that also might include like open house at the beginning of the school year.
Absolutely. I mean, the list is endless.
Yeah, I think I could see that. I'm thinking now a lot about public school and all the things that they put on. Yeah, the list is endless. That's a good description. And with that, this next question was just posted. What about for sports? Where does that fit on the list?
I just read that. And I'm thinking, I don't know these are extracurricular activities. I mean, for graduation, yes, of course, but sports, I don't know. I mean, are they sharing, important information, or are they? You can tell that I don't go a lot to our basketball, right, games or anything like that. But if important information is going to be shared, I think that's the basic principle.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good point. And just to add on to that, since sports are a school program, service, or activity, then at least providing information about how your child could try out, what's involved in being on the team, I would say yes, because it's a program, service, or activity. And I would recommend that the folks today keep that in mind. Just remember those three words: program, service, activity. If it's run by the school district or the school, the answer is yes. How much language access, how much interpretation or translation is needed is clearly, as we know, is going to vary. But at least information so that your child can try out. If their child is interested, you're aware of it. You can sign a consent form if that's necessary. So I guess my acronym for the day is PSA, program, service, activity. Anything that falls under that with the school, the answer, I think, is safe to say it's yes, with the only thought being how much, and that you see from the activity itself. I think we have time for at least this question. Let's see. Whether a qualified interpreter was requested for and provided at meetings reported in the OSPI longitudinal database known as CEDARS. So these are examples: annual IEP reviews, initial IEP meetings, re-engagement plans following an exclusionary action. For districts that have less than 25% of language, it is so hard for this to be a primary focus as a district. And with limited interpreters, our district only provides interpreters for required stuff. And it's so hard to determine which is a priority. So I guess in a sense, doesn't it come down to what you were talking about before? What is a priority and how is that decided?
Yeah, and I think your acronym answers that. Is it a program, service, or activity? Yes, that is real. I mean, it's the reality, right? Not only in Washington, but I think in other states, the shortage of interpreters. And so that's why if there's a language access coordinator or a designated person for this work in the school districts or a team of persons, then that means then maybe we need, hire and train more interpreters to increase that pool. Because although for Washington State, yes, Monica, it's true, we have to report that we had interpreters for these three. That doesn't mean that we only have to provide interpreters for those types of meetings. We have to provide interpreters for any other program, service, or activity, anything else that is important for that family, because this really is only encompassing a very, very small right percentage. And it wouldn't be I mean, I would not call that language access if we're only providing right interpreters for those types of meetings. So it would be speaking with cabinet, superintendent's office in your school district. Go to those that can make those decisions and say, we need to, this is the need, this is the law, and in our district we need to hire more interpreters, whether that means hourly or you need to have funding sources so that you can use vendor or agency interpreters or over the phone interpreters, or any of those services.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think one more question, quick question. The training that you've talked about today, does that include training for how to work with interpreters?
Yes. Yes, when I was talking about as part of the language access plan, train your staff, yes, absolutely. It includes how staff can, or administrators, how to work with an interpreter. And then also it's training on the actual plan, right? How staff can access an interpreter, if I need a document translated and plain language and all of that. Again, in this district, I've only been here for 90 days. So we have not trained our staff yet, but we're building something from the ground up, and we're putting together all those trainings so that we can have staff trained on language access.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to see you again, and a pleasure to work with you today. Great information. And Nisreen, perfect timing, because I was going to say, I'll say what I was going to say. And now here's Nisreen.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a great discussion. Thank you for engaging our audience and providing all of that information. I want to tell everyone about our follow-up resources. So after this webinar, you will get the webinar recording, and with that, you'll get 3 documents. There's 2 documents from AAITE, which is the American Association for Translators and Interpreters in Education. These documents are best practice guides. One is for the staff and teachers on best practices on how to work with an interpreter, and the other one is best practices for the interpreters. So, get your information, share information, and become advocates for language access in education. The third document is an ATISL toolkit on language access strategies in education. So great content there from the professional associations in education that you can take advantage of. Also, as a special offer to our attendees today from this webinar, you can receive a discount to our upcoming e-learning course on language access in education. If you're interested in learning more, please reach out to us at info@brombergtranslations.com. After this webinar, we ask that you please fill out a very short survey before closing Zoom. to let us know how we did today and what other topics you're interested in learning about. Your feedback helps us cater our webinars to your areas of need and provide useful content. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Bruce, Elizabeth. Thank you to all our attendees and everyone behind the scenes. We have more webinars coming up, so make sure to sign up for our newsletter so that you can stay updated. And remember, every step that you take makes a difference for students and families. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Nuzreen.
Thanks, Bruce.